This week's Parsha, Parsha's Vayakhel, Moshe Rabbeinu transmits the command to build the Mishkan to the Bnei Yisrael, but first he lays down the laws of Shabbos. And from this, Rashi says, Al Pi Chazal, we learn that the Binyan HaMishkan, the building of the Mishkan, is not Darchei Shabbos. First comes Shabbos, that's the first priority. After Shabbos, the second priority is building the Mishkan. But building the Mishkan cannot supersede Shabbos. What's the idea behind that? Is what Musar can we learn from this idea that the Binyan HaMishkan isn't Darchei Shabbos? I once explained years ago, Al Pi the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, which says, Da es Elokei avicha v'avdehu. Know the God of your father and serve him. Meaning, it's a two-step process. First, we have to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to have emunah. We have to have yediyah. We have to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After that, we serve him. But if you jump to the avoda, if you try to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu before you have a clear concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're putting the cart before the horse. First, Da es Elokei avicha. Know the God of your father. Yediyah, the emunah, and then we turn to avoda. Shabbos is the source of our emunah. Because what, after all, is our definition of God? As the Rambam says, in the beginning of the Hilchos Sodei HaTorah, we're mechuyev to know that there is a Motzui Rishon, there's a first being, who is Mamtzi, who brings forth into existence all that exists. That is our very definition of God. When do we reinforce that belief? That's Shabbos. Shabbos is the Zecher L'Maaseh Bereishis. It impresses upon us the idea that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world in 6 days, rested on the 7th. Shabbos is the reinforcement of our emunah. Building the Mishkan is the prelude to Avodah. It's the hechsher, it's the necessary preliminary step to bring karbonos, to serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that only follows the Da es Elokei avicha. So first there has to be the ideal of Shabbos, and then you proceed to the ideal of Mishkan. This is the way it has to be. First there has to be Yediyah and the Emunah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then we proceed to Avodah. So therefore Shabbos, which is the source of Emunah, supersedes the building of the Mishkan. I think this Yesod is a emissary Yesod. And I'd like to go off on a tangent and speak about it. We'll come back to our Parsha and see that it isn't adequate to answer the various problems in the Parsha, but the Yesod, which is the pasuk in the Divrei Hayamim, is such an important one, we should dwell on it for a moment. Let me illustrate the idea with a ha'ara from the Pesach Haggadah. Haggadah says, Keneged arba'a banim divrei Torah. The Torah speaks of 4 different types of children. One of them is the Ben Chacham. And that parsha is in Parshas Boaz Chanan. It says that your children will come and ask, Mo ha'edais v'achukim v'amishpatim, what are the various laws, asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu v'eschem. So you should answer him. The strange thing is, we pointed this out in the past, that the Haggadah gives one answer, and the Chumash gives a different answer. The Chumash says, you tell him, Avodim l'farok Mitzrayim, we were avodim to Paro, Vayotzienu, God took us out, He brought us to Eretz Yisrael, He gave us the mitzvahs for our own good, and He considers that tzedakah, it's an act of merit that we perform the mitzvahs. That's what the Chumash says. The Haggadah says differently. The Haggadah says, if the boy asks, what are the mitzvahs? Tell him what the mitzvahs are. Tell him the laws of Pesach. Down to the very last detail that you don't eat dessert after the Korban Pesach. So first of all, one question is, if the Torah gives one answer, why does the Haggadah give a different answer? But secondly, it seems the Haggadah's answer is a better answer. It answers the question. If the child wants to know what the halachas are, that's what you tell him, what the halachas are. And what does the Torah mean when it says you tell the child about Vayotzienu, all the background information? Now the truth is, the Malbim points out that the author of the Haggadah certainly assumed that everyone knows the Psukim, Chumash. Because there's a little word that he inserts there. Va'af ata, also tell him Kelachas Pesach. The implication is that, of course, you're telling him what the Chumash says. The author of the Haggadah is adding. Now, maybe that assumption that we know the Chumash is not always a correct assumption. But certainly for the audience that the author of the Haggadah was writing for so long ago, it's more likely that it was a valid assumption. So the author of the Haggadah is coming to add to the Torah. So how do we understand it? So we explain the past ideas like this, that the author of the Haggadah is telling me the answer. The answer to the question is, tell him the Hilchos Pesach. The Torah is not telling me the answer to the question. The Torah is telling me that when a child asks such a question, before you answer the question, this is what you should say. When a child comes and asks, what are the mitzvahs, what are the dinim, he wants to know the halachas, this is a golden opportunity. You have a captive audience. This is an opportunity to lay down the yesodis, to lay down the foundations. So he wants to know what the halachas of Korban Pesach are. Don't jump to the halachas of Korban Pesach. Tell him the background of Pesach, what it's all about. Avodah ma'inu, vayotzienu, what the idea of a mitzvah is, that it's for our good, how HaKadosh Baruch Hu regards their observance of the mitzvahs. That's what you tell him before you answer his question. The Torah isn't going to tell me to answer the question. If the kid asks, what are the halachas? Of course, you tell him the halachas. I don't need the Torah to tell me that. The Torah is telling me when your children ask the question, before you even answer the question, this is what you should say. That's what the Torah is coming to tell me. The author of the Haggadah is just reminding me, but don't forget to answer the question too. Va'afata also, and more like Hilchos Pesach. And I don't think, by the way, this is a vertical. I think this is really the pshat. That the Torah really is telling me a very important lesson. That when you have a captive audience, take advantage of the opportunity. Lay down the foundations. And all too often in our system of chinuch, I think we make this mistake. Because we take for granted that the yesodis of emunah and hashkafa are already well worked out, and all we have to do is give the dinim. This is a mistake. It's a mistake. Everything has to have a foundation. I'm fond of quoting the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya wrote a Hakdama, an introduction to the section called the Shar Yuchud Ve'emunah, where he talks about the emunah. And he says the following. He says that the yesod of all mitzvahs aseh is avas Hashem. Now, the observance of the Ramach mitzvahs aseh is avas Hashem. The yesod of the mitzvahs lo sasa, of the shasa mitzvahs lo sasa, is yiras Hashem. The yesod of avas Hashem and yiras Hashem, in turn, is emunah. If you don't believe in God, then obviously there's nothing to love, there's nothing to fear. And therefore he says the chinuch of a child must begin with a chinuch in emunah. That's the foundation. To explain to the child, impress upon the child God's existence, that he should have emunah in Hashem. In turn, it proceeds to avas Hashem and to yiras Hashem. And then you can begin talking about the mitzvahs and the halachas. But if you start with the halachas and the mitzvahs before you've laid the foundation, then you're building castles in the air. There's no yesod, there's no basis for avodah. I'm fond of mentioning there's a Gemara in Perkudei, Daf Kuf Vav, that says the two great Rishoyim, Doeg and Achitophel, were master for Talmidei Chachamim, and they were able to discuss 400 shaylas, 400 very deep, profound halachic shaylas, on the subject of Migdal HaPoreach Ba'avir, the tower flying in the air. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Rabusal Miboy boy, what's a big deal to be able to ask questions? HaKadosh Baruch Hu Liba boy, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants your heart. He doesn't want you to contemplate intricate questions of halacha. He wants your heart, he wants your devotion. And that was missing from Doeg and Achitophel. Terrible Rishoyim. That's what the Gemara says. So what does it mean? 400 shaylas and Migdal HaPoreach Ba'avir, and the tower flying in the air. So Rashi says two pshatim. One pshat in Rashi that refers to the top of the letter Lamed. The top of the letter Lamed. Imagine that that in the shape of the letter, not even the entire letter, just that part of the letter, they were able to discuss 400 fundamental, deep shaylas. Another pshat Rashi says it's a reference to a Mishnah Maseches Olos, which says a certain halacha about a migdal priach ba'avir. But I heard a pshat that means like this, that all their Torah was a tower flying in the air. Because there was no yesod, there was no foundation. There was no emunah, there was no avas Hashem, there was no yiras Hashem. They jumped ahead to the halachas, very deep shilas of halacha, but therefore their entire Torah was a migdal priach ba'avir. It was a tower flying in the air. It had no yesod, it had no foundation. It was very interesting. This week I saw an article that was written by an old friend of mine. I live in Los Angeles, and he made reference to something that one of his grandchildren had written, which I guess shows that we're all getting older, because when we knew each other, even his children were very young, and now his grandchild is already in school. And he was reporting that the teacher of his grandchild's school was teaching brachas, teaching about brachas. And as part of the exercise, the teacher gave an assignment, remember these are first graders, to write a list of 100 things you're grateful for. It was the 100th day of school. So in honor of the 100th day of school, they had to write 100 things they were grateful for. And it was very interesting to see what a 7-year-old could put together. The first thing was Hashem, and then he was grateful for his father, and for his mother, and for his brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. As he got to the end of the list, there were some funnier things that were mentioned. But the point was that the teacher was very insightful. The teacher didn't start, what bracha do you make on grapefruit? What bracha do you make on a papaya? What bracha do you make on a mango? What bracha do you make on mushroom barley soup? Which are important things to know. But if you're teaching brachas, the basis of a bracha is the idea that you have to express gratitude. What is gratitude? What does it mean to be appreciative? What do we have to be appreciative for? That's the yesod. After you lay down the yesod, then you do with the halachas. How did the Chazal formalize brachas? Which bracha do you say for this food, and so on and so forth. But if you walk in the first day, and that's your lesson, that on this food you make this bracha, and on this food you make that bracha, and on this food you make that bracha, then essentially you're building a migdal priach ba'avir, a tower flying in air. There's no foundation, there's no yesod. So first you have to lay down the basics. And it's very interesting, there's a famous Rambam in the end of the Perush Mishnayos in Maseches Brachos. We're commenting on that Mishnah, he goes off on a long tangent on the Inyanei Emunah. And the Rambam writes that of all the things that I ever teach, the thing that is most precious to me, the thing that I talk about whenever I have an opportunity, is the inyan of Emunah. That whatever I'm learning, if I have an opportunity to somehow insert something that relates to Emunah, the Rambam says I do that. Because that's more precious to me, it's more beloved to me than anything else that I teach. Because it's the yesod, it's the foundation. And therefore, the pshuto, that would be the idea of our PARSHA. The idea of our PARSHA, that first you have the ideal of Shabbos, and then you have Binyan HaMishkan, is because Shabbos is the yesod of Emunah. This is our opportunity to reinforce on a weekly basis our belief that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, that He's the source of all existence. Building the Mishkan is the hechsher, is the preliminary, the prelude to Avodah. But the order has to be Das Elokei Avicha v'Avdei. First you have to know there is a God, and then you serve Him. So therefore there has to be a Shabbos. If we leapfrog over Shabbos and jump to Binyan HaMishkan, so our Avodah lacks foundation, it lacks Yesod. That would be the simple pshat. However, it seems that the subject is much more complicated. Just a couple of ha'aras. Number one, this is an interesting kasha. The Gemara in Yevamos, on Davav, brings the source of this halacha from a different pasuk. It's a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, which says, "As shabsai tishmaru umigdashi tiro," that you should guard my shabbasais and you should fear my migdash. From that, the Gemara learns out a halacha that binyan Beis Hamikdash is not doicha Shabbos. The question is, why did the Torah have to write that pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim? It's already a pasuk here in Parshas Vayakhel. It seems to lead us to the conclusion that I need a separate pasuk for the Mishkan and a separate halacha for the Beis Hamikdash, and I wouldn't know one from the other. Because if this halacha was true by the Beis Hamikdash, I wouldn't know it by the Mishkan, and if it was true by the Mishkan, I wouldn't know it by the Mikdash. Because if the theory is, as we say, that Shabbos, which is the yesod of Emunah, has precedence over Avoda, what difference does it make whether we're talking about the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash? I should need two separate psukim. So the implication is we're dealing with something much deeper, and that somehow it relates to the nature of Mikdash and Mishkan to the extent that if I would only know one, I wouldn't know the other. How do we understand that? Secondly, there's a tremendous chidush that the Netziv is medayik from the psukim in our parsha. Tremendous chidush. It says in the pasuk in our parsha about the Mishkan, Sheishes yomim te'aseh melacha. 6 days melacha shall be done. In the passive voice. It doesn't say 6 days you shall do melacha. 6 days melacha shall be done. So the Netziv says a tremendous chidush halacha l'mais. It says like this. We know on Shabbos, if a person begins a melacha on Erev Shabbos, and the process continues going into Shabbos, that's mutter. So for example, if you put raw food in the oven before Shabbos, and the food is cooked on Shabbos, midaraisa, that's mutter. Midarabanan, there could be issues of shehiyah, because of gzeri, you might stir the coals to speed up the cooking, but midaraisa, there's no problem at all. Midaraisa, you can begin a process on Erev Shabbos, which is completed on Shabbos. Says the Netziv, that's not the case in the Mishkan. In the Mishkan it says, Sheishes yomim te'aseh melacha. 6 days melacha shall be done. Meaning it must be completed in the 6 days. Nothing can be completed on Shabbos. It's not a halach in what I do. It's not enough that I only work for 6 days. The melacha can only be done during the 6 days. The process cannot be completed on Shabbos. Which really is at first glance, a strange thing. It's not a chilul Shabbos. It's not a violation of Shabbos. If you set the process into motion Friday and it continues on Shabbos, you haven't violated Shabbos. And yet, for some reason, in the Mishkan, this can't be. But the interesting thing is, now the Netziv doesn't say this, but if we look at the psukim, we get the impression that this halacha is specific to the Mishkan. Because in the pasuk by the Beis Hamikdash doesn't say that, but the Beis Hamikdash it says, you should guard my Shabbos, which is addressed to the person. That you should observe Shabbos, meaning the way you observe Shabbos in every other aspect of your life, you should observe Shabbos vis-a-vis the Beis Hamikdash. It doesn't seem that there's such a halach in the Beis Hamikdash that the melacha itself must be completed in the 6 days. It's halacha you can't violate Shabbos, which leads us to the conclusion that when it comes to the binyan Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, the halacha will be not that way. That you could set the process into motion on Friday and it can be completed on Shabbos. This is a halacha which is specific to the Mishkan. Which, if you think about it for a second, seems to address the first question we asked. Because we asked, why do I need two psukim for the Mishkan and for the Beis Hamikdash? The answer is because apparently there is something special in the Mishkan, the proof being that there's an additional halacha, that here it's not enough that I should keep Shabbos, somehow the malach itself must be completed in the 6 days. So, let's put this all on the back burner, and let's point out a very interesting thing. We know, as we said, that when we observe Shabbos, the halacha is we can set a process into motion on Friday, and it completed on Shabbos, and that's not a violation of Shabbos. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world in 6 days, was there anything like that? Was there anything that He started in the 6 days, but somehow it was completed on the 7th day? It seems not. It says in the pasuk, Vayakhel Hashemayim v'haaretz v'chol tzva'im. Everything was completed. So it's really a very interesting thing, that if our Shabbos somehow commemorates what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did in B'riyas Ha'olam, And in the case of Brias HaOlam, everything was completed on Friday. There was nothing that was begun and completed on its own steam on Shabbos. So why is it that our Shabbos has a kula, has a leniency, that we can set the process into motion and it can be completed on Shabbos? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu is resting in the Sheishis Mei Breishis, we don't find that. Now the answer is very, very pashut. There's a very fundamental distinction between the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu works and the way we work. Let's bring it out this way. There's a yesod that the Mekubalim tell us. Very, very famous yesod, the Mekubalim tell us. They tell us that the world, as we know it, has no self-perpetuating inertia. It's not that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world in the Sheishis Mei Breishis, now the world continues to exist on its own steam. But rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings the world into existence on an ongoing basis constantly. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu would withdraw his will for the world to exist, the world would revert back to the primordial nothingness. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was constantly infusing the world with ongoing existence. This is an idea, the Nefesh HaChaim talks about this at length, the Baal HaTanya and the Shaykhut V'Emunah talks about it at length. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin reads this into our daily tefillas. We say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid masa breishis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu renews the bria constantly. So Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin understands that's the meaning of the tefillah, that the world would not exist from moment to moment, but rather HaKadosh Baruch Hu is constantly bringing it into existence. Ka'amur, as it says in the pasuk, la'osei orim gedolim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is called He who creates the great luminaries, not who created, but who creates. Now the question is, but if this is true, then what taka is the idea that the Torah tells us that the world was created in 6 days, God rested on the 7th? He didn't rest on the 7th. Even on the 7th, God was, in a sense, creating. He was renewing. He was recreating. Because what is special about the 6th as opposed to Shabbos if really creation is an ongoing process? The Beis Levi talks about this in PARSHA's Bereishis. And he explains that there's a famous Maimer Chazal Rashi quotes. It says in the pasuk, Vayakhel Elokim bayom hashvi'i, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu finished his work on the 7th day. Now we know that's not true. It says in the pasuk Vayakhulu that everything was finished at the end of 6 days. So what did he finish on the 7th day? So Rashi brings a Maimer Chazal. Ma haya ha'olam chaser. What was the world missing? It was missing menucha. It was missing rest. Ba Shabbos, ba menucha. Came Shabbos, comes menucha. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu invented menucha on Shabbos. So that's the one thing that was finished on Shabbos. Everything else was finished in the 6 days. On Shabbos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu invented menucha. The question is, when you invent menucha, menucha is a cessation. It's a lack of activity. You don't create menucha. It's if you don't do anything, there's menucha. So what does it mean that Vayakhel Elokim bayom hashvi'i, that on Shabbos he brought forth menucha? So Beis Levi says like this, exactly as the Mekubalim say, that Avada there was creation on Shabbos too. HaKadosh Baruch Hu recreates and recreates and recreates every moment, even on Shabbos he's recreating. The difference between the 6 days on Shabbos is that in the 6 days, new things were brought into existence. Every day of the 6 days, there was something new, something that never was before, that was brought into existence. On Shabbos, there was nothing new brought into existence. It was a new hanhaga. It was the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu recreating that which was before, and that is the meaning of menucha. Menucha doesn't mean inactivity. Menucha means the maintenance, the sustaining, the recreating of that which already was. Ba Shabbos, ba menucha. That's Vayakhel Elokim bayom hashvi'i. That's a new hanhaga that was created on the 7th day. But it leads us to the following idea, that everything that happens in the world, from a HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, there's no such thing as a process which is initiated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and then it continues on its own steam. There's no such thing. everything that comes into existence is considered HaKadosh Baruch Hu's act of creation. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided the world should be created in 6 days, and nothing should come into existence on the 7th, it wouldn't have made any sense for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to set a process into motion in the 6 days that would have been completed on the 7th. That wouldn't be called from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective that he didn't create something new. Because if something new would have come into existence on Shabbos, that would have been HaKadosh Baruch Hu's act. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, no such thing that he started the act and then it continued on its own steam. The very concept isn't shaykh to Ribono Shel Olam. Everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu does is always a function of his activity. And therefore, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to observe 6 days and rest on the 7th, by definition, it had to mean that everything was completed on the 6 days and nothing new came into existence on the 7th. But a human being is not that way. A human being, from a human perspective, there are forces of nature which we can harness. So if we initiate a process, and then the process continues through the forces of nature, it unfolds of its own accord, it's not called I did anything. So therefore, really, our Shabbos is exactly like HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shabbos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't do anything new on Shabbos, we don't do anything new on Shabbos. But the difference is that from our perspective, if we would start a process on Friday, and it would continue unfolding by itself, that wouldn't be called that we did something on Shabbos. Whereas by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if something new came into existence on Shabbos, that would be called that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did something new on Shabbos. So really, our Shabbos is exactly like HaKadosh Baruch Hu's. We don't do anything on Shabbos. But for us not to do anything, we don't have to refrain from those types of activities which begin on Friday and unfold on their own on Shabbos. Because that wouldn't be called we did anything. What I did on Friday. Teva, the laws of nature, resulted in the thing coming to its completion on Shabbos. By HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no such thing as something which happens by itself. Everything which happens is called HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it. And Mamela, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to not do anything on Shabbos means that everything had to be fully completed on Friday. But al kapanim, whatever the hesber is, we see there's a fundamental distinction between our Shabbos and HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shabbos. Because our Shabbos means there are things we can't do on Shabbos. But if we start Friday, it finishes on Shabbos, that's not a problem. It's not called we did it. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the nature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shabbos is that everything is complete in the Sheishas HaYomim. Nothing new comes into existence on Shabbos. That's one Hagdama, one introduction. Another Yesod, which we need to understand this Parsha, is an idea which the Medrash speaks out in Parshas Perkudei. The Medrash says an amazing thing. The Medrash says that there is a parallel between the Binyan HaMishkan and the creation of Shemayim V'Aretz, and God's creation of heaven and earth. And the Medrash goes through many Pesukim, Medrash Tanchum and Parshas Perkudei, showing that there are many things in the Mishkan which correspond to things in the world. So, for example, on the second day, it says that Hashem made a havdalah. He made a separation between the Mayim Elyonim and the Mayim Tachtoinim. That corresponds to the Paroiches, which is a separation between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And the Medrash goes on to show many parallels between things that exist in the Mishkan and things that exist in Shemayim V'Aretz. So what's the idea behind the Medrash? What's the point the Medrash is trying to make? Now, the Malbim has a very long arichus in Parshas Truma, where he talks about Rumazim, the symbolism of the Mishkan. And he says a Yesod. He says that the Binyan HaMishkan corresponds to the universe, to the Olamais, to the spiritual realm and the material realm. The Binyan HaMishkan is a microcosm of the universe. And although he doesn't bring the Medrash, l'chara, that's the point the Medrash is making. There is a correspondence between the Bria and the Mishkan. So what's the idea? The idea is this. The purpose of the Mishkan, to create Ashwas Hashchina in the Mishkan, is not just to connect HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the Mishkan. It's to connect HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the world. But we want to create a connection between the Kodesh Baruch Hu and the entire world. That connection is created because there's a Hashras HaShechina in the Mishkan. There is a correspondence between the parts of the Mishkan and the parts of the universe. So Mamela, God's connection to the Mishkan becomes a connection to the universe. And just to illustrate this idea with a mashal, Reb Chaim of Volozhin says in the Nefesh HaChaim that the korbanos are called lechem, they're called bread, as korbani lachmi li'ishai. So obviously it doesn't mean that God eats bread, it doesn't eat bread. So what is the point of calling korbanos bread? So Reb Chaim of Volozhin says an amazing thing. He says like this: that we know that a person is comprised of body and soul. He has a neshama, he has a guf. What do you need to keep body and soul together? You need bread. If you don't have bread, so the neshama dies, the neshama departs. So lechem is that, and that's the expression we use. It keeps body and soul together. So the Ribono Shel Olam is the neshama of the world. Now the world is a physical thing, and the Ribono Shel Olam is the soul. He's the spirituality. Just like the guf has a neshama, the Ribono Shel Olam is the neshama of the world. What keeps body and soul together, so to speak? The korbanos. Right? The korbanos maintain the Shechina in the world. As the Rishonim explained, the purpose of the korbanos is to prevent asiluk hashchina. So it is the bread which metaphorically keeps body and soul together. It keeps the Kodesh Baruch Hu attached to the world, and therefore brings blessing, it brings life, it brings energy to the world. That's the idea of Lech. But this is the idea. The idea of the Mishkan is not that the Mishkan should be like a besieged city that contains the Shekhinah, but nothing radiates outward. Now the idea of the Mishkan is that through the vehicle of the Mishkan, there should be a connection between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the entire Bria. And that connection is affected by the fact that the Mishkan itself corresponds to the various components of the universe, and the spiritual universes as well. So in a sense, when we build the Mishkan, we are building a microcosm of the world. We are, in a sense, modeling our activity after what Ribono Shel Olam did in Bria Soilam. And therefore I think that that is what the Netziv is saying. The Netziv is saying that here there's a special halacha. Because just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he made the world, it wasn't just that he ceased from doing malacha on Shabbos, but it was a Vayakhel, everything was finished. Everything was finished. In the microcosm of the universe that we create, everything has to be finished in the Sheishes Yomim. It's not just a halacha that we have to keep Shabbos, and our chiyuv to keep Shabbos can't be nidche, can't be pushed aside by the mitzvah of binyan Beis HaMikdash. It's much more than that. Our binyan HaMishkan has to model itself after the Bria Soilam. Just like in the Bria Soilam there was a Vayakhulu, it was completed in the Sheishes Yomim, the Mishkan has to be completed in the Sheishes Yomim. So it's not just a halacha that when you have two mitzvahs, the question is, can one mitzvah be deichel the other mitzvah? That wouldn't lead us to the Netziv's Chiddush. We would say, fakir, it's after l'kayim shneiim. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can keep Shabbos and have the Mishkan built on Shabbos. Just start the process on Friday and let it finish on its own steam on Shabbos, and you have both. I kept Shabbos and the Beis HaMikdash was built. But that would undermine the very purpose of binyan Beis HaMikdash, or binyan HaMishkan, I should say. The purpose of binyan HaMishkan is that it should be a microcosm of the Bria, and therefore, in the same way that in Bria So'ilam there was a Vayakhulu, it was finished in the 6 days. The Mishkan has to be finished in the Sheishes Me'amasa. Nothing can happen on Shabbos, even if it would not be a technical violation of Shabbos, because the process was set into motion on Friday. That halacha may be a halacha only in the Mishkan and not in the Beis HaMikdash, for a reason which may be familiar to anyone who's attended this year for a long time. We've said many times it is a very fundamental chiluk between the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. And I'll be the Rambam, who understands that there are two different sources for the mitzvah of building the Mishkan and the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. The mitzvah of building the Mishkan comes from V'asu L'Mikdash V'shachanti B'soicham. The mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim comes from the pasuk of L'Shichnai Sidrishu Uvas Hashem. This is here in the Rambam between Hilchos Beis HaBechira, Hilchos Malachim, and it comes out from the Mefarshim, Lechem Mishnah, that really there are two different psukim. And we explain the difference is this, that in the Mishkan, it is through the building that we bring the Shekhinah. V'asu L'Mikdash, and then V'shachanti B'soicham. By Yerushalayim, it's not that way. Yerushalayim is the Makam HaShekhinah. This is the place from which Bria began. Yerushalayim is the Even Shesi, it's the foundation stone. This is the place from which the Bria began. From that point, the world expanded outward. Here it's L'Shichnai Sidrishu. Find the place of the Rosh HaShekhinah, Uvas Hashem, and come to a place and acknowledge that. So there's a fundamental difference between the Mishkan and the Mikdash. Building the Mishkan brings the Shekhinah. The Mikdash is only an acknowledgement that this is the place where the Shekhinah already is. So in Mela, it's very pashut that to bring the Shekhinah, we are creating, as we said, a microcosm of the world. Therefore, there are halachas, just like the world was made in Sheshes Yamim, this also is made in Sheshes Yamim. Says the Mikdash is only an acknowledgement of a pre-existing reality. Here, it's only a halacha that the binyan can't push aside the mitzvah of Shabbos. So here, it's only a halacha that I can't violate the laws of Shabbos to build the Mikdash. But if it's not a violation of the laws of my Shabbos, because I can set a process into motion on Friday and it finishes on Shabbos, that's not a chisaron vis-a-vis the Beis HaMikdash. So in Mela, I need two different parshas. Because if I only had the parsha of Mishkan, I would have thought that the halacha that you can't build a Mishkan on Shabbos is only because the very nature of Mishkan requires that it be completed in the Sheshes Yamim. When it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, maybe Bechlal is no such halacha. Maybe you could even do it on Shabbos. And if I only had the halacha of Mikdash, I would have said, okay, that's only a halacha that the mitzvah of binyan can't push aside Shabbos. But there should be a halacha that the whole thing has to be finished in the Sheshes Masa, Meichitesi. That's the special parsha of Mishkan. That's why I need two different psukim, two different parshas. But this is the chiddush of Mishkan. And I'll just mention just a ha'ara that is a little tzarchi, and we can think about this. What's the halacha of Yontif? What would the halacha be of Yontif regarding Binyan HaMishkan? Would this special halacha that you can't start the process on Friday and finish on Shabbos be applicable to Erev Yontif and Yontif too? Or perhaps not. The svara would be not. The svara would be that on Yontif would be the regular halacha that the Mikdash isn't doicha, but if you started the process on Erev Yontif, but finished in Yontif, perhaps that would be mutter. After Mayan, right? But on Shabbos, that's the chiddush in the Siv, that this halacha is not applicable. But the idea that we're bringing out is that the halacha of Shabbos in the Mishkan is not a halacha that my obligation of keeping Shabbos supersedes the obligation to build the Beis HaMikdash. It's that the ideal of Shabbos, the idea of Vayakhel and the Sheshes Yamim, is essential to the very nature of what a Mishkan has to be. And perhaps we can be mamtik this, we can sweeten this a little bit with a yesod that the Ramchal says. The Ramchal says in the Sefer Derech Hashem, it's a very interesting thing. You know, the Ramchal in the Derech Hashem really gives a hashkafa of the mitzvahs of the Torah. And especially in the fourth chelek, he goes through the daily mitzvahs and the occasional mitzvahs, and he goes through the time-bound mitzvahs, and he talks about Shabbos. And it's very interesting how he totally transforms the whole discussion of Shabbos. Because if we were talking about Shabbos, our starting point would be the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world in 6 days, and he finished in the 6 days, rested on the 7th, therefore we keep Shabbos. And you would think, how can you discuss Shabbos without mentioning this point, this historical fact? And amazingly, the Ramchal does it. He has a discussion of Shabbos without making mention of this fact. And he turns it on its ear, and he says like this, that the world, the universe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chachamaso understood that there has to be in Yonei Kedusha and in Yonei Chayil. You have to have aspects that are mundane and perhaps even profane, and you have to have things that are holy. And there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance. How much Kedusha and how much Chayil is a good question. What the perfect balance is. HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chachamaso understood that the perfect balance is a proportion of 1 to 6. That's the perfect balance of Kodesh to Chayil. That's what you need. 6 parts Chayil, 1 part Kodesh, that's the perfect balance. And by the way, this Agav is an amazing thing that, maybe we're just accustomed to it, so we think that way, but it seems to me, when we talk about the proportion of weekdays to Shabbos, it's perfect. It's exactly perfect. In other words, if we'd have 5 work days and Shabbos, it would be a little too often. If we'd have 7 work days and Shabbos, it would be a little too infrequent. It just seems that it's exactly, we have enough Shabbos, though of course maybe that's only because we're accustomed to it. It's hard to know, maybe it will be different when we get accustomed to that. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chachamaso understood this is the appropriate amount, and therefore he created a cycle of 6 days leading to a Shabbos. What happened to the historical fact that Hashem made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th? It's PARSHA. But the Ramchal is coming to answer a very serious question. It just happened to be that Hashem made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th? Why did he do that? In other words, we're taking it for granted. HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world in 6 days, rested on the 7th. So therefore, we work 6 days, we rest on the 7th. Very good. Now, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do it that way? Where did HaKadosh Baruch Hu come up with the number 6 from? So we don't even ask that question. We assume, of course. It happened to be. He did it in 6 days, and mainly rest on the 7th. That's why we have Shabbos every 7 days. But we never asked the question, so why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu make the world in 6 days? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood, right, that the days of his creation are going to be Chayil. And the day of his resting will be Kodesh. And therefore the decision as to how many days to devote to the one and how many days to devote to the other is rooted in the more fundamental question of what is the optimal balance between Kodesh and Chayil. So when he determined in his mind that the optimal balance is 6 to 1, that is why he made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. It's not that just for some reason that we don't know, he worked on 6 and rested on the 7th, and therefore 6 are Chol and 1 is Kodesh. It goes the other way. Because that is the optimal balance of Kodesh and Chayil, that is why he made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Because the days of his activity would be days of Chayil, and the day of his inactivity would be Kodesh. And the Ramchal goes on to explain there, in that same section, that the reason inactivity is related to Kodesh is because Kedusha, by definition, is a nituk. It's a pulling oneself away from Inyonei Chayil, from creation, from activity, from dealing with the material. In other words, it's not so much that because Shabbos is holy, therefore, in order to be free to engage in holy pursuits, therefore we don't do malacha. It's much deeper than that. That's the essence of what it means to have a Yom Kodesh. A Yom Kodesh is a day that we are menutak, we are removed from physicality, we're removed from material things. That is the very, very definition of what it means to be Kodesh. And therefore, that's why it's the day of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's inactivity that becomes Mamela, the day of Kedusha. And that's the idea. You see, in the same way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to create Kedusha in time, was Keveya, this day is removed from physical, material activity, to create Kedusha in Mokang, to create Kedusha in the place, there had to be the quality of Shabbos. To create a Mishkan, to create a place where there is Hashras Hashchina, where there is Kedusha, right? That comes from the ideal of Shabbos. It's the fact that Shabbos is introduced into the very fabric of the Mishkan That's what gives the Mishkan its sanctity. Shabbos is the mocker, is the source of all our kedusha. Even the kedusha of Mokam, even the kedusha of the place of the Mikdash, depends on the kedusha of Shabbos. And therefore, if the Mishkan would not embody the quality of Shabbos, the Mishkan wouldn't be what it is meant to be. And therefore, it's not a question of my observance of Shabbos. It's much more than that. It's that the Mishkan itself has to be the embodiment of the observance of Shabbos, and therefore it has to be Vayakhel, it has to be completed in the Sheishes Hayamim. It's needless to say, when it comes to our observance of Shabbos, it's a very difficult challenge, because we all have careers and we have jobs and we have interests. To be able to pull ourselves away from our thoughts and our activities is a very, very difficult thing. Well, I'll share with you a very important thing, which is a ha'ara l'maisa. And the pasuk says, "Zochar Shem Shabbos l'kadsho." You have to remember the Shabbos day to keep it holy. Chazal say that the entire week you should remember Shabbos. You know, the Ramban says this is why the days of the week don't have names. We refer to them by number, so there's a constant reference to Shabbos. In a practical sense, what does it mean the entire week? We should think about Shabbos. The Gemara says that when you go shopping, if you see something good, so if it'll keep till Shabbos, you should buy it even on Sunday. Okay, that's one aspect of it. The Sforno says a very simple pshat. The Sforno says you should arrange your affairs in such a way that you'll be able to complete them before Shabbos. In other words, people have jobs, people have a lot of things they have to do, and sometimes we're not the most organized people, so as a result, it comes Friday, we have to tear ourselves away from what we were doing, and as a result, it's on our head the entire Shabbos. But really, with better organization, we could organize our lives in such a way that really everything would be done before Shabbos. If we would live our lives that way, with that type of organization, then Shabbos would be different Shabbos, because everything would be done. It wouldn't be, like Rashi says, you should look at a ki'ilu malachtacha asuya. It would be as if. It really would be that way, that everything was done. So an interesting ha'ara, that the Mefarshim ask that in Parshas Vayakhel, the mitzvah of Shabbos is put before the mitzvah of building the Mishkan. And in Parshas Kisisa, it's the opposite. The mitzvah of building the Mishkan is put before Shabbos. So how do you explain that difference? And there are many pshatim and many populim. I'm going to point out a very, very simple cheshbon. That in theory, when you talk about the abstract idea, then of course the Sheishes Masa come before Shabbos. So on Har Sinai, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, of course the presentation is the 6 days before Shabbos. Vayakhel is Moshe presenting it to Klal Yisrael. Now you have to be practical. It says you want to have a Shabbos, you have to discuss Shabbos and think about Shabbos before the Sheishes Masa. Before the 6 days you have to think about Shabbos. So therefore, here at Parshas Vayakhel, when Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking Lamaisa, brass tacks to the Jewish people, first he says, you should know there's a Shabbos. That's the first thing. Now there's a Mishkan that has to be built. But since you already know there's a Shabbos, so it's not going to be that we're building a Mishkan for 6 days, and all of a sudden, an hour before Shabbos, the alarm goes off, oh, gotta stop, pull myself away. Where the whole organization, the whole seder of how the Mishkan is put together and constructed and how it's managed is all designed to accommodate Shabbos. So therefore, Kamufan, in the Lamaisa of it, you have to put Shabbos first, and then you build the Mishkan. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Parshas Kisisa, when he speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu, was speaking in the theoretical sense. Of course, in the theoretical sense, the Sheishes Hayamim come before Shabbos. But in the practical sense, which is Moshe transmitting it to Klal Yisrael, of course, the ideal of Shabbos is first. Unless you go into the week Sunday with the idea of Shabbos, then how will you be ready for the next Shabbos? Now, Shabbos has to be something which is in our minds already Sunday. How are we going to conduct ourselves this week? How are we going to make sure everything is taken care of so we can go into Shabbos? And Shabbos is a real Yom D'Nishmas, a day of the Neshama, really a day of Kedusha.